Good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name is Caitlin Cox, and I'm the Manager of Fundraising and Events here at Institute. Welcome to this month's Institute webinar. We ask that you please remain muted for the duration of the presentation and use the chat box feature for any of your questions. I'm honored to introduce today's speaker, Claire Lauder, IOM, CAE, MPP. Claire has been a Chamber and Association executive since 1989 and is passionate about helping organizations succeed through strategic direction in industry best practices. In 2016, she formed her own consulting company, Lauder Nonprofit Strategies, LLC, to provide strategic planning, benchmarking, and mentoring to Chamber and Association clients with a focus on helping smaller organizations. And she's also personally one of my favorite Institute faculty members. So thank you so much for joining us, Claire. We are so excited to see you and have you.
Delighted to be with all of you today, Caitlin, and thank you so much for that very kind, though maybe a little over the top, but anyway, I appreciate it.
I've missed you.
Nice introduction. So we are here today to talk about keeping your board focused on their responsibilities and the parentheses out of yours. I have been hearing a lot from Chamber and Association executives during this pandemic that their board members are trying to be a little more involved in the day-to-day business of the Chamber than in the past. And so because of that, I thought this might be a good topic about how to keep them focused. I suspect, and this is just, I'm no psychologist, I think when they feel out of control in their own business, they maybe think that the organization is an easier place to make a mark, but I could be totally wrong about that. But in any case, these are all suggestions that are helpful at any time, not just now when people are a little overwhelmed. So what happens when we have board members who don't lack direction? Often it ends up with micromanagement. They do committee work, not board work in the board meetings. The board work, of course, being oversight, not the day-to-day work of the Chamber. They tend to second guess committee recommendations. You get situations where committees make a recommendation to the board and the board wants to second guess it or change the recommendations instead of listening to the people that spent the time learning about the issues. You get rogue committees that are not tied to organizational goals, and we'll talk about strategic planning and how you can help with that. Special projects. Don't we all just love special projects and the wouldn't it be great ifs? Everybody's got an idea, and it's easy to get pulled off of what your priorities as an organization are because somebody had a great idea of a special project we could take on right now. And then one of my favorite base commanders in Maryland used to talk about idea fairies. And that's those ideas that just pop into people's brain. And it's kind of the same thing as a wouldn't it be great if. But I love the concept of the little idea fairy sort of in the corner of your brain going, oh, look, we could do this and we could do this and we could do this without an understanding of the resources that are actually available to do those sorts of things. So the question, of course, is how do we keep them on track? And that's what we're here to talk about today. There are 6 keys to success, and we'll go through each of them separately. Strong bylaws are the beginning of a good base for your organization. Board orientations are critical so that they know what they're supposed to be doing. A strategic plan with big goals, not just a list of events, but we need to address workforce development. We need to address the supply chain. How can we support our members in the problems that they're having in their day-to-day businesses? I'm a firm believer in a new president orientation. We'll talk about that. And then the importance of board president and CEO or executive director communications. So much can go wrong there. And finally, succession planning. How do you make sure that you've got the people lined up to be successful and help the organization be successful going forward? Let's start with the strong bylaws. These are the rules that govern the internal management of the organization. And I know you're all IOM graduates, so this should all be review. But your bylaws are the foundation of your organizational process and of your decision making. They must be consistent with federal, state, and local laws, which take precedence if there's a conflict. Chambers are always, and associations are always trying to tell me, well, but our bylaws say, and the answer is, if your state law says you can't do it, I don't care what your bylaws say. And then other topics in your bylaws are things like eligibility, election of directors, conduct of meetings, standing committees, and responsibilities. Things that the bylaws should include are that the board hires and supervises the CEO or executive director, whereas the executive director hires or supervises the staff. You do not need a board trying to be shadow supervisors of staff. It's confusing to staff and results in conflicting directions often. I like to see that the CEO or executive director's removal requires a board vote, not just the president or the executive committee. This avoids 2 or 3 people getting together who don't like that person and deciding they want them gone. I will tell you that in practice, it's very hard to get boards to put that in the bylaws, but I throw it out because I do think it's a best practice if you can get them to agree. Term limits for board members and officers are an absolute must. It keeps you from having the people who say, well, but we've never done it that way, or, well, we tried that in 1969 and it didn't work. I actually had a board say that to me in 1989. So we don't care what happened 20 years ago. We care about what might happen now. The world has changed. And the other thing about term limits for board members and officers is that if you have a problem one, you have a way to cleanly move them along. I hear too many particularly smaller organizations that don't have term limits and they're stuck with somebody who's been on the board for 20 years and is holding them back, and they don't have a way to move them along gracefully. You want to have clear roles and responsibilities of your officers in your bylaws, and then the role of the executive committee. And it's very important that the executive committee not replace your board. Anything that the executive committee decides should come back to the board for confirmation. CEO or executive director should be ex officio on the executive committee, on the board, and on the nominating committee. Obviously, there are times where they will need to go into executive session, but quite honestly, really the only good reason to do that is for an evaluation of your CEO or of you as the CEO. And if they're going in for any other reason, it probably means trouble, so be prepared. An annual performance review for the CEO or executive director should also be included in the bylaws and when that should take place. If it's in the bylaws, then you can hold them to it. If it's just a procedural matter or a policy, it's much harder to get them to stick to it. You want to have very clear limits on who can speak for the organization. Usually it would be the CEO or executive director and the president or chairman of the organization. You do not want every committee chairman or individual board members speaking for the organization when they're not authorized to do so, although it is possible to authorize them in specific, for specific reasons. And even when you do have somebody who's authorized, you have to be very careful. I remember when I was a very young chamber CEO in Pascagoula, Mississippi, we had our shipyard go on strike, and the chairman of the chamber was the head of the owner of the local McDonald's. And he went on camera and he said that the shipyard strike had reduced his business by 40%. And I can promise you it did not say owner of local McDonald's. It said chairman of the Jackson County Chamber of Commerce. And there were a lot of fires put out down at the shipyard. So making sure that people know what they are allowed to say and what they aren't allowed to say, and are very clear in speaking about who it is that they are speaking for, whether it's themselves or if it's the organization. And again, I don't think in this case, even if he'd said he was speaking only for himself, they wouldn't have put that out there. So being very conscious that is when you're the chairman of an organization or the CEO, that people are going to assume you're speaking for the organization. And the last thing I really like to see in bylaws is a clear process for removing a board member for cause, particularly non-attendance. Too often we let board members continue on even when they're not showing up, and that actually is a violation of their fiduciary responsibility. One of the problems I often see in bylaws are the president acting independently of the board not being apprised of executive committee actions, overuse of executive sessions to keep staff out of the decision making. Again, there are very, very clear reasons to use executive sessions, and they should be very limited. Board trying to become involved in staff supervision other than the CEO. Finance reports not being provided to the board. This would seem like such an obvious one, and yet I know several organizations where they've had a long-time CEO and they just trusted them to handle things, and the next thing they knew, the organization was in major financial trouble because the finances were not being properly handled. Often that is also a case where the CEO is making maybe more than the budget supports, and so it wasn't in their interest to let people know that. And the last one I see that, again, can be solved by strong bylaws is boards taking votes by email. It is possible to do that, but it needs to be a unanimous vote with everybody participating. And I've written a whole article on that if anybody needs it, but it's available on my website and also on the Institute website. So while not every issue can be prevented by strong bylaws, if you don't have them, the problems can be inevitable. So just always go back every few years, go back and review your bylaws, make sure they are reflective of what your policies and what your practices are, but that they're current and that they address any problems that can become. Now, one of the hazards can be you have a problem come up and you say, oh my gosh, we're going to have to amend the bylaws to make sure this doesn't happen again. You don't want to be in that position. You want to be proactive about it and make sure you have the right things in there now.
Claire, we have a question for you.
Yes.
Just a point of clarification. Do you consider the president to be senior staff and the chair to be a senior volunteer?
So thanks for that. I was trying to go back and forth between both. So depending on the size of the organization, sometimes it is chairman and sometimes it is president for the lead volunteer. And for the staff, it is sometimes president and CEO, which is a lot to write on a screen. And sometimes it's executive director. So if I say CEO, I generally am meaning president and CEO, with the counterpart being the chairman. But again, adjusting for your own organization, with chairman being your lead volunteer and CEO being, and if everybody's okay with that, I will just go ahead and continue to use CEO and chairman. But I didn't want to leave out any smaller organizations who are executive directors, because I know sometimes they feel kind of kicked to the curb.
Awesome, thank you.
Do you have a thought on that, Caitlin?
No, I think you clarified perfectly. You know, everywhere you go, the language changes. I think making sure that we have it. Oh, a thanks just popped up. So yes, that did clear the air and clarify that there. But there's definitely different language from organization and definitely location to location. So thank you very much.
Yes, I'm actually working with a chamber right now that is trying to revise their bylaws to shift from an executive director to a president. And I actually have to finish reviewing those right after this presentation. And they were not consistent along the way. And so they've ended up with things that the president is doing that really is the chairman. It's just a matter of editing. But you have to be really careful that you're consistent and that the right people are in the right roles in your bylaws. So moving on to board orientations, and I hope that everyone is doing these, but I know it's been difficult, particularly in the last couple of years, and often board members will say, oh, we don't need an orientation, we've been here forever. We know what we're doing, and yet so often they don't. So your board orientation should set board member expectations. What if you expect them to recruit members, if you expect them to be at a certain number of events, if you expect them to attend a certain number of meetings, certainly no more than 3 missed in a year, or 3 in a row absolutely means that they probably aren't committed enough to the board. Some organizations have a specific amount that they're expected to give. So thinking about what those expectations should be and having a board commitment form. And I always use whatever organization I am speaking to's own board commitment form to go through those expectations. You want to be clear in the board orientation about roles and responsibilities, especially the difference between board and staff and who directs staff beyond the CEO. Again, carrying over from your bylaws, but sometimes they need a reminder. Their fiduciary duties of care, loyalty, and obedience. Conflict of interest, I'm going to hit these each individually. Antitrust avoidance, apparent authority, which is who's going to speak for the organization, and then what the organizational priorities are. And often we combine our board orientations with a strategic plan. So just to quickly review what those responsibilities are, the purpose of a board is to govern, to focus on strategic direction, support the organization with their time, talent, and treasure, follow their fiduciary duties, explore opportunities, but recognize the shortage of resources, back to avoiding those wouldn't it be nice ifs and the idea fairies, to develop policies and procedures, and to manage the risks of the organization. So we rely on our board of directors to govern and on professional staff to manage. Board responsibilities, as I guess I hit most of these. Board meeting attendance, event attendance, financial support, committee service is something that we often ask of our board members. Paying attention to financial and resource oversight. Confidentiality often comes up as a risk management issue. Having people come out of a board meeting, and I just had this happen in a strategic planning session where someone came out of a confidential board meeting and then misrepresented to another organization she's on the board of what had happened in that meeting, and it has caused quite a bit of trouble. It is important that they all disclose conflict of interest and that they adhere to the mission of the organization. Now, associations tend to have more focused missions. Chambers tend to be all over the place. That can get chambers into trouble because your mission can literally be anything. So trying to narrow that down and being clear that you're there for the business community is a benefit to the organization in getting things done.
Claire, what is the basis for the unanimous email vote?
There are a number of studies. So the most states, 44 states, require that there be simultaneous communication to meet the duty of care, which is to say people have an opportunity to ask questions and to share their thoughts. And the court has stated that doing that in an email is not simultaneous. There are ways you can do it as long as you make sure that everybody answers by email and that everyone is unanimous, which has to be a fairly non-controversial issue. It then becomes unanimous written consent, but most state laws prohibit email votes sort of willy-nilly. And Karen asked me to update my article and update the chart of what the different states ask for. It doesn't appear to have changed much, and it's a pretty big project, but I am working on that right now. Does that answer the question?
I believe it did. Thank you.
Okay. So for the board meetings that work, you want to use their time well. If they feel like their time is used well, they're not going to go off on tangents. Also, they won't have time to. So you want to start and end your meeting on time. You want to stick to your agenda. That's really helpful for the what ifs and wouldn't it be nice ifs and the idea fairies. Focus on what's important. Stay out of the weeds. Stay out of the details of programs. That's for committees to handle. Use your strategic plan as a guide. I ask organizations, and we'll come back to this, but I recommend organizations be reviewing their strategic plan at least quarterly, and sections monthly is better to stay on track. We all know that nobody actually does anything until it's on the agenda that they need to do it, or after they get the minutes saying, oh gosh, I forgot I did that. I said I would do that. Your chairman really should make sure everyone is heard. It is too easy for the quieter voices to get lost. So making sure if you haven't heard from somebody that their voice is heard. Not doing that leads to parking lot conversations, which can not only be disruptive for the organization, but also can lead to breaches in confidentiality. And then if their board comes across a proposal that needs more detail, then it should go out to a committee or a task force. And if it's just a one-off thing, I like a task force rather than a committee because they can do their job and move along. A few danger signs of board meetings that are rambling. Rambling discussions with no limit is always a problem. Doing committee work during board meetings, as I said, delegate to a committee or task force. Not sticking to the agenda. Believe it or not, I run across organizations that don't even have an agenda. They come together in their board meeting and discuss whatever has been going on in the organization over the last month. That is dangerous, 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 and it's going to take you down rabbit holes you don't want to go down. So please make sure you have an agenda for your board meetings and that your chairman is sticking to it. Diverging side conversations usually means that somebody isn't feeling heard. Not having a strategic plan or not paying attention to it is a definite danger sign because it keeps them on the high road. And then dismissing others' opinions or not eliciting them. And I know we would think that dismissing others' opinions in a board meeting would be something we don't have to say, but I actually did have that happen in one of my own boards where actually one of our top funders asked a question and one of the executive committee members says, "Oh, that's just stupid." And I can promise you that that board member did not ever want to speak again with that person in the room. So please be really aware and ask your chairman to be aware of listening to the voices in the room. That's why they're there. Any questions on that so far, Caitlin?
We do have one that just popped in
Okay.
about when the presentation is done. Can you overview the different responsibilities of the executive committee versus the board?
It may already be in there, but if it's not, yes.
Thank you. That's all we have for now.
Okay. You may have to remind me. So the fiduciary responsibilities, fiduciary means the relationship of confidence or trust between the board members and staff. And it's the responsibility of the board to protect the organization and its resources. I always remind boards that's not just the money, but staff time, volunteer time, those are also assets, and you have to be conscious of how you're using them. The duty of care, which is the one I referred to regarding email voting, is that officers and directors must be diligent and prudent in managing the organization's affairs, handle their board duties with the care an ordinary prudent person would in a like position, and that means attending board meetings regularly so you know what's being discussed and the decisions that are being made, showing independent judgment, not just going along with the crowd because it's easier, knowing about organization resources. That goes back again to what else do we have that we're doing that's taking time and energy, what other commitments do we have for our financials, and actually knowing what those financials look like. The board should only delegate to responsible individuals, people who have proven themselves to follow through, and then following up regularly, which is not the same as micromanaging. It's just making sure that the things that have been committed to are getting done. The duty of loyalty requires that they act in good faith, that they not put personal interests above those of the organization, that they avoid conflicts of interest, both in fact and appearance. And that can be a tough one. It is really best if somebody has a conflict that they recuse themselves and then remove themselves from the room. And I have had a few instances where that happened, where if someone doesn't remove themselves from the room, others in the board are uncomfortable asking questions that maybe need to be asked. Duty of obedience to purpose. You have to act within your corporate powers. You have to comply with state and federal law. I already mentioned if there's a conflict, that law obviously takes precedence. And then establishing accountability measures. Again, that's not micromanaging. It's what does success look like, and are we there? Are we doing the things we would say we would do, and are we using our resources effectively? So risk management, this is why I held off on this. So conflict of interest is a big problem for a lot of organizations. It arises when someone who's in a position of authority to make decisions for the organization could benefit financially. An example I have of this is that we had a board member, actually a past chair, who did our annual directory. There was a point at which she was 18 months late in delivering an annual directory, and we did not yet have a conflict of interest policy, nor had we discussed it. I was fairly new in the organization at that point. And that is part of why it went as long as it did, because no one on the board was willing to ask the questions, why isn't this happening? How do we get it done? and that person still sat on the executive committee, so those questions were even awkward in the executive committee. So again, if there is a conflict of interest, you want that person to recuse themselves. It does not preclude board members from having dealings with the organization. They just need to do that at arm's length. And if there's a discussion about contracting, they need to leave the room. And I always say, when in doubt, recuse. It's never wrong, if you think there could be a conflict, to step out of the room and let others discuss without you. Antitrust is a bigger problem for associations, but I have seen instances where it is a problem for chambers of commerce as well. Precludes discussion of pricing or elements that could impact company operations. If you were talking, for instance, about what salary we're going to pay to attract people to our industry, and say several restaurants are all getting together, including that they're not going to go above $14 an hour, let's say, that would qualify as antitrust, and I could certainly see that happening in a chamber situation. They cannot agree to limit competition. They cannot say, this is my territory and this is your territory and you can't work in my area. No discussions of boycotts, blacklisting, unfavorable information about particular companies. And there are very heavy fines for this, up to $100 million for a corporation, $1 million for an individual, and prison time. So this is really serious. The good news, if there's any, is that it's been rarely enforced. The bad news is that it can be, so it's better to stay ahead of these issues. We talked already about apparent authority, who speaks. Be very clear, make sure your board members understand through their orientation. They can say, I can't speak for the board. I can offer my personal opinion. And please be wary of having volunteers commit to contracts if they don't have authority to do so. If they make a verbal commitment and they're portraying themselves as being a representative of the chamber for this matter, it can be binding. We already discussed lack of confidentiality. Even if a director disagrees with the result of a board vote, in public, he or she needs to support it as a decision of the board. And as I said, parking lot conversations are automatically a sign of danger. And this doesn't preclude, the board still needs to report to the membership what they're doing, but not every conversation and not every detail. So if we don't have more questions on the orientation, I would move on to the meaningful strategic plan.
We are ready to move forward.
All right. So your strategic plan should be the consensus of the board. It is sometimes easy for execs to say, oh, I'll just write it, it'll be easier. But you really need the board's buy-in. So the industry phrase, if they write it, they will underwrite it, but it really is true. And I just worked with a small organization. When they hired their exec, she wrote a 3-year plan. It was a good 3-year plan. She executed on it, but it was very operationally oriented. And so when I was in 2 weeks ago, we were able to put together a plan that was much more responsive to the needs of the business community, because they had a hand in what needed to be in it. And then they are now working on their strategy to make sure that they execute on it. I like to see at least one aspirational goal. What could we accomplish in this planning cycle that would make a pivotal, real difference to our business community? In the case of this particular organization, better promotion of their local businesses is sort of a standard chamber goal, but they have major problems, as everyone does right now, with workforce and being able to recruit people. And so that's going to be their big goal for the year. And then while I ask that organizations look at where they are in their existing strategic plan monthly to quarterly, you should review the entire thing at least annually and say, okay, do we still include the things that we need, or the things we need to adjust? Do we need to adjust our timelines to make sure we're successful? And I already talked about this. So you want your strategic plan to drive all your initiatives, however. So I mentioned rogue committees early on. And if you tie all of your committees to the initiatives in your strategic plan, first of all, you'll have plenty to do and plenty for your members to be involved in. But you will also keep from having committees that are spiraling off on their own. And my example from my last organization was a wellness committee that they insisted needed to exist, but had absolutely nothing to do with the goals that the organization had set, or what our business community was asking for. And they ended up being a real drain on resources, including having committed to some contracts that they weren't actually allowed to commit to. So luckily not huge dollar numbers, but anyway, and then so the strategic plan can keep them focused on the big picture, keeps them out of the day-to-day details of the programs. You want to build structures for success of your strategic plan. Committees, task forces, and strike forces established based on your goals, not because we've always had that committee, or because somebody thought it was a good idea, but because it is part of your priorities for the next 1 to 3 years. I use task forces and strike forces for short-term goals. As I said, a task force meets until the goal is accomplished. Strike forces I think of as meeting 3 times, once to define the problem, once to discuss solutions, and once to finalize their recommendation. Then they go away. That can be 3 times in 3 weeks. It can be 3 times in 3 months. If it's much longer than 3 months, it's probably a task force, not a strike force. And structuring can focus your organization's energy, especially the board's, on accomplishing the priorities you identified in your plan. Risks of committees are creating programs that don't fit with the organization's goals. As I said, making financial commitments, not providing adequate notice to advertise programs. I had a notorious small business council group that would come to me 3 weeks before an event and want me to advertise it in the newspaper, in the magazines, in social media, with no understanding that most of the deadlines had been 3 weeks prior to that we had lead time of as much as 6 to 8 weeks, depending on the publications. Failing to clear plans with the CEO and the board before moving forward, you can end up with conflicts in programming that is very embarrassing and destructive for the organization. And then committees should not speak for the organization unless they've been given authority to do. Sometimes, particularly with a legislative committee, you will give them the ability to speak on certain issues, but they should have been cleared through the board first. So key number 4 is a board president orientation. A lot of organizations skip past this, and this by board president or board chairman is the volunteer lead, is what I mean by this. They need to understand it is their role to lead the board, not to manage. They need to understand and respect the differing roles of the board president, the CEO, executive director, and the staff. Again, president, chairman, interchangeable. Board chairman and CEO should act as a team, not as employer-employee. This tends to be more of a problem in smaller organizations, but it is something to have a discussion about in advance and have an agreement. The board chair should be advancing the organization's goals. This is not time for personal projects. It's about the members, not about them. And they need to help identify and develop future leaders so that you aren't left hanging if either they have to leave or at the end of their term. This is not a conversation for a CEO to be having with the board chair, although if your relationship is good, you may be able to be part of that. The best thing is if you have a good board president who's outgoing or someone who's been really strong in the past, to have them have that conversation. We always say put a volunteer between you and trouble. Peer-to-peer communication is always going to be more effective. So here are the standard board chair responsibilities. Preside at board meetings, consult on board agendas, appoint and assist committees, lead annual review of the CEO. It should be documented in writing. This is for your protection as much as for the organization's. They should initiate board policy recommendations, ensure the board is following their governance requirements, help to cultivate major stakeholders. That is definitely not a staff-only job. If you can get your board chair to go with you to meet with major stakeholders, you're going to be far more successful. Again, it's that peer-to-peer conversation. They should be supportive of the CEO or executive director, and you want to make sure as people are moving into that role that they are. And then they should be clear about the roles and responsibilities between the chairman and the CEO. Guidance that I generally share, and much of this comes from Bob Harris's Hit the Ground Running, which is an excellent, although long document. You may need a summary. They should be reading the governing documents. They should know their team, set realistic goals. That comes through the strategic plan, be guided by the mission, follow the strategic plan. Again, no pet projects that are not involved and referenced in the organization's plan. And they need to think long-term about the organization, not just about their term. A few of the pitfalls I've seen are the personal legacy, which is why I mentioned it several times, rather than the organization's goals. Presidents and chairmen who speak publicly on issues that the board hasn't taken a position on are a real danger. If they're talking about you behind your back, that's probably a problem. They should be discussing concerns directly with the CEO before they go to others. Micromanaging, obviously, is a problem in many organizations, hopefully fewer and fewer. Interfering with or directing staff other than the CEO. Pursuing their own agenda. These are all pitfalls that I have seen, and I'm sure you all have too. So a part of that orientation should also be establishing how the board chairman and the CEO are going to communicate. You want to plan regular communication between the two. For some people, that can be once a month. For some people, that needs to be every week. I know I had a board chairman who I knew didn't do well on the phone because he got distracted easily. And so we planned for a weekly Friday afternoon, every Friday afternoon meeting at his office where I could go eyeball to eyeball and know he was listening to me. I tend to do that too, so I'm not faulting him. He's one of my favorite people. But when we scheduled that as every week, we knew that probably twice a month was all we would make, and that was okay. We knew that was enough. We talked on the phone between, but at least we had it planned. It was on our calendars, and we were able to make that time in our schedules. You want to clarify communication preferences. Some people love to be texted. Some people hate to be texted. Some people are fine catching up by phone. Some people really need to be in person. You want between your board chair and CEO to have open and fair dialogues. In that two-person conversation, you should be able to say what you're thinking without being worried that it's going to leave the room unless both parties agree that it needs to. If there are conflicts, they should be talked out before they're taken to a larger group, certainly before they go to the board of directors, but really you should make a stab at that before it goes to the executive committee. And they should both respect each other's role in the organization. I like to see an agreement between the chairman and the CEO signed in advance. I don't have a draft of this, but the things that I recommend is that they will regularly consult on matters that are important to the organization. That includes disclosing any storm clouds on the horizon before they become a problem. It should require clearly defined expectations and goals for the CEO so that they can be measured against that. If there's a conflict between the president and the CEO, agreeing to discuss it internally on paper. Agreeing on paper to discuss it internally before taking it to the board or executive committee, outlining the preferred communication methods as I referenced, including the board in the decision-making process. It is always risky, and this goes to the executive committee role versus the board role. If you have an executive committee or a board chair who are making decisions without consulting the board is going to say, why are we even here? They don't need us, and then you end up with declining engagement and declining attendance. And then agreeing in advance who's responsible for the agenda preparation. Is that going to be the board chair? Is it going to be the CEO? Are they going to work on it together? And there's lots of different ways to do that, but being clear about whose responsibility that is at the outset is the important piece. So then the last piece that I think is key is succession planning. And it is a responsibility of all board members to identify future leaders. The CEO has a key role in determining who board members should be because you or they are the person most often working with the volunteers the most closely. But the board also has to be one that the CEO can work with. Don't forget to ask prospective leaders to join your efforts. I remember we were dwindling on board members. And as we had new people join the organization, we started asking, is this something that you're interested in the future? And it was amazing how many said, oh, yes, actually, I would like a leadership role down the line. And so we were able to route them into committee work or task force work so we could see their dedication before we brought them onto the board. The nominating committee, of course, plays a role, but so does every board member in bringing people in. And then look to your committees as a source of future leaders because they're vetted. You've been able to see them perform. I like to see leadership mentoring and leadership training for prospective board members and committee chairs. And not every organization is able to do that, but even using your state or national organization to provide that kind of training is helpful. The Maryland Chamber Executives are actually having a program on Friday where we're doing a mini board orientation that we're inviting leaders to so that they can talk about governance issues. More succession planning. Don't be afraid to ask if current board members want to be an officer. You may be surprised who raises their hands. If it's a bad surprise, you know that you need to prepare to keep them from assuming that role, but often it's really a good surprise. You should include your chair-elect in discussions and meetings with the CEO to establish continuity. I'm sorry, with the chair and the CEO to establish continuity. Plan for future board chairs at least 2 terms out. Life happens. We had at one point, we had a chair need to leave for personal reasons. And then the first vice chair had to leave because her husband had cancer. And thankfully we had 3 deep and were able to go to our next person. And then make sure your prospective leaders understand the organization's culture and can work with it. We had one incident where we brought somebody onto the board without vetting them, without having them involved in committees first, and they hadn't been around the organization long enough. They had lots of idea fairies. And in the end, it was not a good match. They were really on the board to pursue their own agenda and not to pursue the agenda of the organization. Bonus tip, I mentioned having performance evaluations in your bylaws. They are your friend. Nobody likes them, but it helps to have documentation of your past performance if you have a rogue chairman coming in. The board should have an expected timeline and a policy for annual review. You will still have to remind them they don't like to do it any more than you like to do it. Use the opportunity to give them a list of things you've accomplished and the successes of the organization. You should get a written copy of the completed review as CEO, including any comments, and it should be kept in your employee file. And then if there are performance deficits, they should give you 90 days to remedy them is a best practice. So I'll stop there and go to my last slide but we had this question about executive committee versus board of directors. So some organizations have their executive committee meet more frequently than their board of directors, or monthly before their board of directors. I always use my executive committee as a sounding board. Associations often have much larger boards of directors, and the executive committees become more like a board of directors, and so that's something to keep account of, but you still want to make sure that your board feels valued and like they are a part of decision making. Executive committee can take action if the board is not able to convene, especially since we already discussed why it's dangerous to do email votes with your board. But the board should then always be informed of the decision that was made by the executive committee and have an opportunity to weigh in on it. And so, Caitlin, did that answer the person's question?
It sure did from my perspective, yes. Thank you. And thank you for this awesome presentation.
Thanks, Caitlin. So, and I wish I could talk to the rest of you, but you're all muted. But that's one of the things I hate about this kind of presentation is that we can't all be together and sharing our ideas, because I do think that makes for a better presentation. So just a closing thought. Empowering your board by giving them tools for success and clear information about their role is key to avoiding your problems. If they don't know what they're supposed to do, they are far more likely to engage in unproductive behavior. And so keep them channeled, keep them focused, and get the best out of your board. And quite honestly, they'll feel appreciated and like their time is being better used if you have them focused on the big issues of the organization. Happy to take any other questions.
Just seeing a ton of thank yous in the chat box. So Claire, we really appreciate you taking your time to share your knowledge with us at Institute. You are always so generous with your expertise and your experiences, and we're very grateful for that. To everybody that's watching, we encourage you to go to institute.uschamber.com for the latest updates on registration for upcoming sites for our next webinars, and to get your 100-year anniversary coin that we have available. So
I should have brought mine up. I already have mine.
Oh man, that's right. You were one of the very first ones to get a hold of yours. Well, thank you again, Claire. Thank you everyone for tuning in. We look forward to seeing you at next Institute webinar.
Thank y'all. It's nice to be with you today.